Linda thought she was safe. She thought no one knew. But the moment she walked into that hospital room and saw who was lying on that bed, her whole world stopped. Margaret Collins had spent 31 years of her life loving one man. She woke up before sunrise every single day, made breakfast, ironed shirts, raised 3 children, and never once asked for anything in return. People in their neighborhood called her the quiet one, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned over the years that saying too much only caused pain. Her husband Richard was a respected man, a senior manager at a large construction company. He wore expensive watches, drove a black Mercedes, and spoke with the kind of confidence that made people in meetings go silent. At home, however, Richard barely noticed Margaret anymore. He came home late, ate whatever she had prepared without a word, and disappeared into his study. Margaret told herself it was stress. She told herself he was tired. She told herself that this was just what marriage looked like after 30 years. What Margaret did not know was that Richard had not been staying late at work at all. 3 nights a week, he was driving 40 minutes across the city to a quiet apartment building where a woman named Linda Voss was waiting for him with wine, dim lights, and a smile that made Richard feel 20 years younger. Linda was 34. Richard was 58. She called him her person. He called her his escape. Linda had met Richard 2 years earlier at a company dinner where she worked as an event coordinator. Richard had complimented her earrings. She had laughed. That was all it took. Linda knew Richard was married. She had seen the ring. But Richard had told her early on that his marriage was dead, that he and Margaret were just living together out of habit, that Margaret was cold and uninterested. Linda believed every word. She had no reason not to. Richard was charming, generous, and convincing. He bought a perfume, paid her rent twice when she was short, and once surprised her with a weekend trip to a lakeside hotel. Linda had started to believe that she was the real woman in his life. Then one Tuesday morning, Richard did not show up. Linda texted him. No reply. She called. It rang and went to voicemail. She waited 2 hours and called again. Nothing. By evening, she was worried. She drove past his office building and saw his car still parked outside, even though the building had already closed. Something felt wrong. The next morning, she finally got a message, but it was not from Richard. It was from an unknown number. The message said only 4 words. Richard had a stroke. Linda sat with her phone in her hand for a long time. Her first thought was not about herself. It was about Margaret, because Richard was in a hospital right now, and Margaret was his wife, and Linda had no idea what was about to happen next. Margaret got the call at 6 in the morning. The hospital said her husband had collapsed in his office the previous evening. A colleague had found him slumped over his desk. He was alive, but in serious condition. Margaret did not cry immediately. She moved quickly the way she always moved when someone needed her. She grabbed her coat, told her daughter to stay with the younger children, and drove to the hospital alone in the dark. When she arrived, the nurses recognized her immediately as the wife and took her to the room. Richard was lying with tubes in his arm and a monitor beeping beside him. He looked smaller somehow, not like the man who once made entire rooms go quiet. Margaret sat beside him, held his hand without saying a word, and stayed there for hours. By the second day, family and close colleagues began arriving. Flowers filled the small bedside table. Richard's brother flew in from another city. His colleagues sent cards. The room felt full of people who respected Richard, people who saw him as a strong and successful man. Margaret received them all quietly, thanking them, offering coffee from the hospital cafeteria, making sure everyone felt comfortable, even though she was the one who had just been told her husband might not fully recover. And then, on the 3rd day, something happened that none of them expected. A woman arrived at the hospital reception asking for Richard Collins. She gave her name as Linda Voss. She said she was a close friend. The receptionist called up to the room and Margaret answered. Margaret asked the nurse to tell the woman she could come up. When Linda stepped off the elevator and walked down the hallway, she did not expect to be greeted. She expected to wait somewhere, maybe sign a visitor form, maybe peek through a door. What she did not expect was to find Margaret Collins standing calmly in the hallway outside Richard's room, wearing a simple navy dress, arms folded gently, looking directly at her. Linda stopped walking. The two women looked at each other in silence for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Linda's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Margaret looked at her the way a person looks at something they already knew was coming, not with rage, not with tears, with something quieter and far more difficult to explain. She said simply, "I know who you are." Linda felt the floor shift under her feet. She started to speak, to explain, to apologize, but Margaret raised one hand and said, "Come inside. There is something you need to hear." Linda followed her into the room. Richard was awake. He turned his head, and when he saw Linda standing next to Margaret, the color drained from his face completely. Margaret sat down in the chair beside his bed. She looked at Richard and said in a calm, low voice, "I found the messages 8 months ago." Richard said nothing. The monitor beside him beeped steadily. Margaret continued without raising her voice. She said she had read everything, every message, every lie he had told Linda about their marriage being dead. She said she had spent 8 months deciding what to do. She had thought about leaving, she had thought about confronting him, but then she decided to wait, because she wanted to see how far he would go and how long it would take for his own choices to catch up with him. Linda stood near the doorway feeling like she was no longer in her own body, because Margaret was not screaming, she was not throwing things, she was sitting beside a sick man and speaking in the voice of someone who had already done all her grieving in private long before this moment. Then, Margaret opened her bag and placed a brown envelope on the bed beside Richard's hand. She said she had spoken to a lawyer. Everything was already prepared. Richard looked at the envelope and then looked at Margaret, and for the first time in perhaps many years, he looked genuinely afraid. Not of losing Linda, not of the hospital, but of losing Margaret. He said her name quietly, the way he used to when they were young. Margaret stood up and smoothed the front of her dress. She looked at Linda and said something that Linda would never forget for the rest of her life. She said, "He told you the marriage was dead, but he came home to me every night. He ate the food I cooked. He slept in the bed I made. Ask yourself what that means about how much he respected you." And then she walked out of the room. Linda did not move for almost a minute. She looked at Richard. Richard looked at the envelope. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that Margaret had not already said better. Outside in the hallway, Margaret pressed the elevator button and waited. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were dry. She had already cried everything she had to cry in her kitchen at 2 in the morning over the past 8 months while everyone else was asleep. Now she was done crying. Now she was walking forward. The elevator arrived and she stepped inside. The doors closed, and the woman who everyone had always called the quiet one left that hospital with more dignity than either of the 2 people she had left behind in that room would ever fully understand. 3 weeks later, Richard recovered enough to come home, but home looked different now. Margaret had moved into the guest room and filed the papers. Richard tried talking to her several times. He stood in the kitchen doorway while she cooked and told her he was sorry. She thanked him for saying it. She meant it. But she had learned the difference between an apology that comes from guilt and an apology that comes from understanding. Richard was guilty. That was real. But guilt was not the same as change. Linda, on the other hand, had stopped calling. After that day in the hospital room, she had driven home and sat in her apartment for a long time. Richard had told her the marriage was dead, but she had seen Margaret's face. She had heard Margaret's voice, and she had realized that the only dead thing in that marriage was Richard's honesty, not Margaret's love. She felt something she had not expected to feel in that moment. She felt sorry, not for herself, for Margaret. And that feeling did not leave easily. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Margaret's daughter called her one evening to say that she had seen Richard at a restaurant, alone. Linda had not been seen with him since the hospital. Margaret listened and then said something that surprised her daughter. She said, "I hope he figures himself out. I spent 31 years hoping that. I can spare a little more hope from a distance." Her daughter laughed softly and said, "Mom, you are unbelievable." Margaret smiled and said, "No, I am just finally free." She was sitting by her window when she said it, with a cup of tea in her hand and the evening light coming in warm and golden through the curtain. She looked exactly like someone who had lost a great deal and found something even greater on the other side of it. She looked, for the first time in a very long time, completely at peace.